A new chapter has opened in the economic relationship between the United States and Canada. On May 30th, 2025, the US government made a significant move. It announced a plan to double the existing tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. This decision raised the tariff rate from 25% all the way to 50%. This policy officially took effect on June 4th, 2025, sending immediate signals across the integrated North American economy. This is not a minor adjustment. It is a major policy shift that affects businesses, workers, and consumers on both sides of the border, creating a new level of uncertainty. The US administration explained its reasoning behind this substantial tariff increase. The official justification was framed around the concept of national security. The government argued that protecting domestic steel and aluminum producers is vital for the country's ability to manufacture essential goods for its own defense and infrastructure needs. This move is part of a wider, more aggressive trade strategy that has been unfolding throughout 2025. The stated goal is to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States and reduce the country's reliance on foreign supply chains, which are seen as a potential vulnerability in a volatile world. This action, however, creates immediate and complex problems for the North American market. The economies of Canada and the United States are not separate entities. They are deeply intertwined. For decades, companies have built supply chains that cross the border multiple times before a final product is even assembled. A tariff acts like a tax on this process, forcing companies to pay more for essential materials like steel and aluminum makes it more expensive to produce everything from cars to washing machines. This cost pressure can lead to difficult decisions for businesses about where to source materials and where to build their products. The response from Canada was swift and firm, signaling that it would not simply absorb this economic blow. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government immediately announced its own set of retaliatory measures. These counter-tariffs specifically target US steel and aluminum, placing a 25% tax on those goods entering Canada. This direct response affects a significant volume of trade, valued at approximately 29.8 billion Canadian dollars. It is a clear message that Canada views the US tariffs as an unfair and harmful action against its closest trading partner and is prepared to defend its own economic interests forcefully. The impact of this tariff escalation is felt most acutely in the manufacturing heartlands of both nations. The automotive industry, a cornerstone of the North American economy, is particularly vulnerable to these changes. Car makers in both the US and Canada rely on a seamless flow of parts and raw materials across the border. A truck carrying engine components might cross from Ontario into Michigan, and the finished vehicle might later be exported back to Canada. The new tariffs disrupt this finely tuned system. The higher cost of steel and aluminum directly increases the price of making vehicles, a cost that manufacturers will likely pass on to consumers through higher sticker prices on new cars and trucks. Beyond the auto sector, the entire metals industry is now facing immense pressure. Canada's steel industry is a major economic driver, supporting over 100,000 jobs and exporting roughly 15 billion Canadian dollars worth of steel to the US each year. Similarly, about 94% of all the aluminum Canada produces is sold to American buyers. The 50% tariff makes Canadian metals much more expensive for US companies, threatening these sales and the Canadian jobs that depend on them. Ontario. Premier Doug Ford described the US policy as an economic war, highlighting the risk to American jobs as well, as US factories that need Canadian metals will now face significantly higher operating costs. This trade dispute also brings energy into the spotlight, a sector where Canada holds significant leverage. As the world's fourth largest oil producer, Canada is a critical energy supplier to the United States. It sends about 3.8 million barrels of crude oil south every day, a trade relationship valued at around 130 billion Canadian dollars annually. This dependency gives Canada a powerful economic tool. If Canada were to redirect even a portion of these oil exports away from the US market, it could create a supply crunch. Experts estimate such a move could raise fuel prices in the US and impact its economy by as much as 30 to 35 billion US dollars. The financial consequences for businesses and consumers are becoming clearer. US manufacturers that use steel and aluminum now face a difficult choice. Media Group, US manufacturing plant managers in discussion, stressed executive in factory office at stock at distribute_equally. Absorb the higher costs and accept lower profits, or pass those costs on to their customers. Premier Ford estimated the tariffs could ultimately cost US consumers an additional $15 billion. In Canada, businesses that rely on US parts are also feeling the pinch from the retaliatory tariffs. This back-and-forth disruption creates a climate of instability, making it difficult for companies to plan for the future, invest in new equipment, or hire more workers, leading to a potential economic slowdown across the continent. In the face of these trade challenges, Canada is not just playing defense, it is actively pursuing a long-term strategic pivot. The government has unveiled a comprehensive economic plan designed to reduce its heavy reliance on the US market. This strategy involves significant investment in major domestic infrastructure projects. The goal is to build new trade corridors that can connect Canadian producers to markets in Asia and Europe more efficiently. This includes modernizing ports, expanding rail lines, and investing in new energy sources like nuclear power to support industrial growth and create a more self-sufficient and diversified national economy for the future. A key piece of this infrastructure push is the recently expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline. This project has dramatically increased its capacity, going from moving 300,000 barrels of oil per day to 890,000 barrels. This expansion is a game-changer for Canada's energy sector. It provides a direct route for Canadian oil to reach Pacific ports, opening up lucrative and growing markets across Asia. In March 2025 alone, Canada exported over 7 million barrels of oil to China through these new channels. This demonstrates a tangible shift, allowing Canada to leverage its vast energy resources on the global stage and reduce its dependence on a single customer. On the financial front, Canada's retaliatory tariffs are already generating significant revenue. As of early June 2025, the government has collected $1.7 billion from the taxes imposed on US goods. These funds are not simply going into general revenue. Instead, they are being strategically repurposed to support the Canadian workers and businesses most affected by the trade dispute. The government has created programs to help companies manage the disruption, including initiatives like employment insurance work sharing, which helps businesses avoid layoffs, and tax deferrals to ease cash flow pressures for affected industries. Recognizing that its own tariffs can also harm domestic businesses, the Canadian government has shown a degree of flexibility. In April 2025, Prime Minister Carney announced a 6-month tariff holiday for certain US goods. This temporary exemption applies to products that are essential for Canadian manufacturing and public safety, giving businesses time to adapt and find new suppliers without crippling their operations. The auto sector was also given a special remission, but it came with a condition. Car makers must maintain their current production levels in Canada, ensuring that the policy supports Canadian jobs while navigating the complex trade environment. The current trade standoff between the United States and Canada marks a fundamental shift in a relationship long defined by free and open commerce. For decades, the North American Free Trade Agreement and its successor, the USMCA, fostered deep economic integration. The current tariff-heavy environment challenges this foundation, forcing both countries to reconsider their economic strategies. The path forward will require careful navigation and a renewed focus on shared interests. While the immediate focus is on conflict and retaliation, the long-term prosperity of both nations depends on finding a way to resolve these disputes and restore a more stable and predictable trade environment. One potential avenue for de-escalation is through dialogue and negotiation. Many industry leaders and policymakers on both sides of the border argue that the real threat to domestic steel industries comes not from each other, but from the global overproduction of steel, particularly from China, which often circumvents trade rules. A more collaborative approach could involve the US and Canada working together to address these larger global market distortions. By focusing on the true source of the problem, they could potentially find common ground that allows them to roll back the damaging bilateral tariffs and strengthen the North American market as a whole. In the meantime, Canada's strategy of diversification appears to be a necessary and prudent course of action. Building stronger trade ties with Asia and Europe is not just a reaction to US policies. It is a smart, long-term plan for a middle power in a changing global economy. By expanding its infrastructure and seeking new markets for its key exports like oil, minerals and agricultural products, Canada can build a more resilient economy that is less vulnerable to policy shifts from any single trading partner. This pivot will require sustained investment and political will, but it promises greater economic security in the long run. Ultimately, the future of the North American economy hinges on whether partnership can prevail over protectionism. The integrated supply chains, shared resources and common values that have bound Canada and the US for generations remain powerful assets. Moving forward will require leadership that recognizes the immense cost of a prolonged trade war. In terms of higher prices for consumers, lost jobs for workers, and diminished competitiveness for businesses. Finding a diplomatic resolution that respects national interests while preserving the benefits of open trade is the most critical challenge facing both nations today.